So I am thrilled to welcome back to Northshire Jim Shepard for his new book, Phase 6. He is the author of 7 previous novels, including the prize-winning Book of Erin and 5 story collections. His short fiction has appeared in, among other magazines, The New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, McSweeney's, The Paris Review, The Atlantic, Esquire, Tin House Granta, Zoetrip, all of them, basically. And he's often been selected for the Best American Short Stories and the Pin O. Henry Prize Awards. He lives in Williamstown and teaches at Williams College. His new novel, Phase 6, which we've been talking about, has been called thought-provoking, emotionally sustaining, and with a style that brings bracing poetry. And we're lucky, as you all know, to be joined by National Book Award-winning author Andrea Barrett, the author of most recently Archangel. There in the chat. I'll put the link again, and Jim, take us away.
Hey, Jim.
Hey, Andrea, how are you?
I'm good. We're really glad to have you back. Welcome everybody again. Great celebration because Jim is back. We thought we lost you. We were just like vamping helplessly here. And not in my case doing a great job at it, but I feel really lucky to have the chance to talk with Jim tonight about his new novel, which even for Jim is really gorgeous. It's fierce and darkly humorous, very relevant, and I have to say completely relentless. I really couldn't put it down. I read it a couple of times now, and each time I'm sucked in completely by it. We thought we'd start this evening by just having Jim read a brief passage, and then we'll talk a little bit, and then we'll open the floor to questions and see where we go from there. So Jim, you want to start us off with a little reading?
Yeah, I have just enough narcissism for that, Andrea. So we'll go for a few minutes and we'll do chat. I'll read from the very beginning, but I'll also skip around. So when you do detect gaps, you should imagine them filled with the kind of prose you prefer. The beginning goes like this. It had gotten colder overnight, and the gravediggers had had to use a pneumatic drill. Alec had had to listen to it all morning. The Lang family all stood off to one side of a shallow hole with a coffin in it while their kids played around the graves. Malik asked without looking up if Alec wanted to join the club called Everyone Hates Alec. And Alec watched 2 3-year-olds down the hill piss on the same spot in the snow and said he was already a member. Some of the grave sites had little white fences around them, and some were just white crosses among the rocks. Some of the graves had seashells on them, and some were just white crosses, and some held plastic flowers or wreaths. While the minister talked, Alec and Malik scrolled through pictures of other people's pets and vacations. By the time the minister finished, it was sleeting. So when the service was over, a lot of people headed back to their houses, and the family almost had to fill in the grave alone. When Alec looked back, the wind was blowing even the frozen dirt off their shovels. When he looked back again, halfway down the hill, they'd finished with the dirt and had rolled all the bit large stones on top and were posing for their photographs with their hoods up. An older kid named Tavik was ahead of them, heading down the hill. "Want to see the most stupid expression in Greenland?" Malik asked him. When the kid looked up, Malik pointed at Alec. Some 15 years earlier, the government of Greenland had announced that it had approved 4 times the number of mining exploration licenses granted in the previous decade. An Australian company had already begun zinc and lead mines on the northern coast, and 56 other active licenses were granted for gold, rubies, nickel, copper, and rare earth minerals, including neodymium, praseodymium, dysprobium, and terbium. The mines were promoted as contributing to the green economy, since 80% of the rare earth deposits would be used in wind turbines, hybrid cars, and lasers. So the pitch became, global warming in Greenland, we're part of the solution. Instead of publicizing a lot of moping and moaning Inuits trooping off to international conferences to lament the destruction of their fishing grounds, why not focus on the resources that native geologists were discovering every day under the vanishing ice sheets? Either you sat and just reacted to what was hurtling toward you, or you worked to get a hold of whatever opportunity brought along. Every settlement council had its visionaries who could anticipate hundreds of generated jobs and accompanying new airports and roads and hotels, when it was pointed out that 90% of the world's mines, 90% of the world's rare earth minerals came from China, and that the environmental degradation that those mines had left behind was stunning, the glass half empty types were refuted with the reminder that the goal of self-sufficiency had to trump the notion of a continent changed beyond recognition, and were further chided that they couldn't live in a museum, and that the country was so huge, how could a few mines make a difference? Malik had liked what he'd seen of the new mining camp, 3 cargo containers with doors that he and Alec guessed were offices, and 2 tents on the bare rock around a big hole dug in the permafrost, with one of those sectional chain link fences that anyone could slide under. They visited the camp the next 4 nights, and on that 4th night, back on the dirt pile, Alec showed Malik a rock he'd unearthed with some digging. It was glassy smooth on one side from the polish Ice Age glaciers had given it 11,000 years earlier. But what had also caught Alec's attention was a cavity where the surface had been spalled off, a scar of fractured crystals, of feldspar and hornblende and ancient ice. Alec had been taken with the contrasting textures and had brought his friend's palm over to experience the difference between polish and edge. 2 days earlier, the drill bit, its relentless pounding on the rock, had finally broken the chemical bonds holding it to its ledge. And when that seam had cracked and the stress boundaries had separated, a cluster of molecules that had previously thrived in the respiratory tract of an early variant of the Bering goose, and that had been trapped with some throat tissue in the crystalline framework during the Holocene glaciation, had been reintroduced to the air and the warming sun. Even lying there in the darkness and dirt, Alec could smell them, like heated metal. He had Malik smell too, those molecules that were now released to become a part of something new. The next day, they both had sore throats and made fun of how much their noses were running. It rained so much you could hear the runoff on the road from inside the house. They went down to the water near the old halibut factory and sat in their favorite spot on one of the cement wharves built into the rock. Near where the cable for the hand winch for dragging boats or whales up onto the ramp ran into the water, a dead dog floated under the ice. Alec wiped his nose with his sleeve and then wiped Malik's. Around lunchtime, they walked back to the supermarket in the middle of the settlement and sat on the big flat rocks where the brook became a waterfall into the harbor, and some of the mine workers showed up and sat next to them and started eating and drinking. The wind off the water helped with the mosquitoes. 3 of the mine workers were white and 1 was dark-skinned. The foreman recognized Alec and nodded at him, and Alec and Malik were close enough to hear their talk. Some were speaking Danish and some something else. The foreman seemed interested in teasing them and kept running his hands through his own hair. So Malik pretended to be thrilled and told him, "You're so tall and handsome," and then was happy when the foreman and 2 of the men laughed. Then the dark-skinned worker showed them a funny video he'd taken of one of his drunk white friends falling down a flight of stairs. And the mine workers talked about getting to go home the next day. They were happy about it. Then the dark-skinned worker and Malik showed each other their phones. And the mine workers shared some Danish bread they had bought at the supermarket and some snow crab they had gotten at the tourist restaurant. Everyone loved the snow crab, and there was a lot of it, so it was passed around. And in that way, their shared fork became a fomite, from the Latin fomites, for tinder or fire starter, an object that when contaminated with an infectious agent will transfer that agent to the new host. I'm going to stop there, Andrea, because as you might guess, shit goes downhill from there.
And because what is better than fomites, really? I think you're the person who taught me that word. One of the things I thought we might talk about is, until now, you've been most celebrated for your historical fiction. You've written about everything from people in ancient Rome to farm wives in upstate New York in the mid-19th century to people in the Warsaw Ghetto. And this is a leap into the future, what you might call speculative fiction. And I know historical fiction and speculative fiction superficially look a little different, but I'm guessing maybe for you, not so different in terms of how you do the research and how you inhabit the imaginative space you're making. Can you talk about that transition a little?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, speculative fiction, if it goes too far forward, turns into something that my imagination doesn't deal with very well. And so the idea of writing, what would the world be like in 2350 or something? I'm like, I just short out. And part of it is I'm just, I don't know if I don't have the imagination for it or the interest in it, but I discovered that when I was thinking of writing in the future, I wanted to very much write in the very near future. Of course, I think Amy Hempel once quoted to me Mark Richard saying, or maybe it might have been Waits, or somebody said, talking about a piano, your hands are like dogs, they go where they've been before. In my case, the kind of research that is mobilized for historical stuff, I've simply mobilized for the near future. And one of the ways you do that, I think, is you find those passages or those moments in the past that seem to inform the future. And you sort of pull it out of the past and lay it before you, essentially. If you believe, as a lot of pessimists do, that those of us who don't learn from the past are going to repeat it, that process seems to make more sense. If in this case, for example, the passage that concludes the book, which I don't think I'm giving anything away by just saying it's the passage that concludes the book, comes from the Lisbon earthquake from 1755. So I'm sort of dragging stuff out of the past and bringing it into the future because it seems to me the best way of reconceiving of something that I otherwise have trouble conceiving of, So that's part of, I think, how I would go about something like that. I think when I'm writing about the near future, I'm sort of imagining the present in just a little more extreme form, rather than thinking in terms of, oh, we all have hover cars,
Right.
implants.
That really makes sense. I was saying the moment when you were gone for a little bit there, I mentioned that I had just read the new Michael Lewis book, The Premonition, and so I had learned a lot about all the chances we had before this present pandemic to do something about the gaping holes in our public health system. And I also felt on almost every page of that book that you had been every place Michael Lewis had been doing the research for that. That you had read a lot about 2006 and 2007 and 2009. Is that the case?
It is, although Michael is more interested in policy than this book is. As you know, I tend to focus on the worm's eye view. And so, not only am I focusing on the poor index patients, but I'm also focusing on the lab wonks and the people who at the CDC feel like they never see the window, never mind make policy. And so the sense of the catastrophic PR moves that Michael chronicles very well are not really a central focus of my book. My characters sort of look up every so often and register that people are doing the wrong things. But one of the things that I had trouble predicting in terms of the next pandemic was just how badly we would react politically. I imagined all sorts of ways in which predictably a Republican governor would act poorly, but the idea that one of our two major parties would decide to just turn away from reality was not something I saw coming, for example. And frankly, I'm not that interested in top-down kind of fiction. If I had to write a novel about what it was like to be running the CDC when a pandemic hit, I don't think I would have written that novel.
I mean, I do think that's one of the glories of this book. There's amazing elements to it on every page, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like something in your structure and in the language of your, just sentence by sentence, the way you move through the book, made it possible for you to, at the same time, have that worm's eye view, to be very intimate and very deep within your characters, and also to pull out and give us the wider view when necessary. And usually people can't do that. When they try and put those two things together, it's terrible. It just sticks out on the page. And you actually managed to do micro and macro at the same time to have this very deep emotional resonance with your characters, and also to insidiously slip us a huge amount of information. So one of the things I wanted to ask you was how it seemed like the book structure had a great deal to do with that. It's very compact. It's divided into 12 chapters, and then there's these wonderful, sometimes very tart, often very funny subheads that you use to structure the chunks in between. It allows you to move between character point of view, but I think it might be also what allows you to shift tones like that, to be very intimate and tender at one point, and then also, you know, from there to leap into stuff about policy or the CDC. Is that the case? And if so, how did you figure that out? Did you always have that? Or
I think that's really
did it come
astute.
later?
Yeah. And not only was it a way of doing it, it was a way of reminding myself that I needed to keep doing it, because the only way I thought this was going to be able to work is if I stayed pretty light-footed and moved very quickly. And those little subheadings were a really nice way of reminding me it's time to move on, right? It's time to light somewhere else, essentially. My tendency is so much to stay in the intimate and the worm's eye view that I always err on the side of a perverse lack of information. And so having those subheadings and having that reminder that I could get omniscient for just a paragraph, for example, and then move on to another subheading, was a reminder that I really did need to inform the readers of what was going on in a global way. It's just too perverse to have somebody, you know, in Greenland who doesn't know what's going on tell the story. And in fact, one of the, you know, having delivered the book as the pandemic was just breaking, I had a year to sort of edit it. And in that year, part of the main process of editing it was slimming it down even more, because, you know, if exposition is all about telling people what they need to know that they don't know for the, you know, for the book to have any kind of, make any kind of emotional sense at all of that stuff that I thought, well, nobody knows this about the microbe. You know, we all had a forced education in that. And so each month I would be stripping stuff out that I thought had been crucial. And the book just got slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. And, you know, my editor got paler and paler as the book went on.
It's
By the
beautifully
end, you know,
compact.
it was a haiku, you know. But I've often, you know, I like fictions that feel more like guerrilla actions and less like, you know, massed invasions. And so I want to hit the ground running and get out quickly anyway. And that's sort of what this book does.
It does. I was going to ask you to read one of the tiny little sections with a great subhead, just to show what you can do with this. There's a section that kills me every time. It's called Countertops and Pump Bottles and Door Handles. And it's just a paragraph. Can you dive into that for us?
I can, yes.
It's, I think it's on page 28.
All right. So this is one little section, and the title is Countertops and Pump Handles, or Pump Bottles and Door Handles, and credit cards and credit card readers and escalator railings and elevator buttons and phones and pens and water bottles and zippers and wine glasses and coffee cups. Yusuf Zaki's nephew was getting married in Iceland and he wanted to be there. And he'd convinced his girlfriend from Marseille to come along as well. And he stopped by Global Grooming out of boredom. 3 American boys, Kenny Lee, Aaron Friedman, and Ben Stahl, heading home for spring break, considered upgrading their headphones before reminding themselves that there were no bargains at airports. A Chinese-Canadian family on their way to visit their son on his year abroad passed Yussi, coughing, and the father scolded him in Mandarin to cover his mouth. 5 Scottish girls commandeered the miners' table at Malthus, and one cleared away the unbussed trays and dishes before eating her carrots and hummus with her hands. A Swiss couple with a baby took the table after that. 2 Austrian lawyers whose connecting flights had been delayed used the men's room stalls after Christian and Willem. Anything the miners touched, any number of people touched after them, and anything those people touched was available to any number of hands after that.
That's so amazing. It's a half a page, and reading it, you have made it possible for all your readers to actually almost physically watch the germs scatter out of Greenland and all over the world. You can see them flying all over the world. And every step in the book comes from that moment, that tiny set of lines. And so in that sense, it is like a haiku. Everything is compacted right there.
You know, it's also the effect of having grown up watching movie after movie after movie, right? I mean, my generation grew up on cinema, and I was also one of those kids who was dumped in front of the television a lot as a babysitter. And so I watched, because I was in the New York area, I watched hundreds of movies on the movie channels, and it just informed the way I imagine narrative. And so operating cinematically as opposed to ruminatively has always been my first impulse. And what that allows, I mean, obviously there are drawbacks, right? But one of the things it allows is real speed and moving from image to image and moment to moment and that kind of thing.
It's an incredibly fast-paced book. Another thing that really struck me about it was very quietly, but very insistently, it's an extremely feminist book. I mean, all the chief actors in the book are women. They're solitary, they're hardworking, they're brilliant. They're really good at dealing with men who just constantly dismiss them or underrate them. They just push them out of the way and move on. You never point towards that. You never make a big deal about it. No one ever talks about it. It's just if you step back from the book and look at it, you realize, oh, everyone who's making anything happen in here is a woman, with the exception of Alec, who's a little boy. Did it just grow that way? Was that a conscious decision, or how did that come about?
It began with my wanting to have, you know, the CDC will almost always, with an outbreak like this, send two people. And often it's one woman and one man. But I thought, you know, women have such trouble in these worlds in terms of getting taken seriously when they arrive somewhere, that I like the idea of two women going, especially because of the amount of suspicion that the CDC people have to overcome the instant they arrive, and the idea that they have to immediately start flexing their authority. Seemed like a really interesting dramatic situation. So I immediately then had two female protagonists from the CDC. And then as I started thinking about ER docs, I also thought, yeah, that's going to be female as well. And suddenly I had all female protagonists. And the idea then in retrospect appealed to me for exactly the reasons you're talking about.
It really changes the way we read the book. We're forced to check our own assumptions frequently too. I liked that very, very much.
I'm glad.
When you went to Greenland, did you go to the hospital there, or any hospitals there?
I did, yeah. I went to the hospital in Ilulissat, which is the main hospital I was going to be writing about. The little settlement where everything starts in Ilamanok doesn't have a hospital. And you have to wait for the ferry to get to the hospital. And that also appealed to me for dramatic reasons as well. So it was actually kind of hilarious to be interviewing the doctors in Ilulissat about a pandemic and having their, you know, eyebrows start to go up, like, why are you asking me about this kind of thing? And then they would discover that I was writing fiction, and then they would think, why am I in this room with you? How did this happen exactly, right? Because what I did was I told them I was writing for an American magazine, and that made me look a little more serious to them. So they were willing to start the process of interviewing me. And usually what would happen is I would get 5 or 6 questions in, and they would get them answered before they would throw me out of their office and go, I don't have time for this, you know. And so then I would move on to the next doctor. And in that hospital, there's only 6 or 7 doctors, and I hit them all essentially. And thankfully they weren't exchanging notes at that moment. So they were sort of, I'm sure like a week later, they were like, that guy came to you too? He bothered me too, essentially, you know. So I was there about a week, and I hit them all at one point or another.
So did you have much of the book done before you went there? I'm curious how you knew even what questions to ask.
Yeah, I did have a big part of the book done, and that had created a huge number of questions, right? Because as you know, as you're doing this sort of research and you start writing, and you're like, okay, so they fly the boy to Ilulissat, and then what does that look like? What happens when you get there?
Right.
And that's what I had to be asking about. But of course, they don't want to give out all of that information. So it was a little touchy pushing them on some of that stuff. But I ended up getting what I needed anyway. And then being a fiction writer, I could just make up the rest of it. So
Did you go to the CDC too?
I did, but I'd gone to the CDC before. And it turns out that nothing in the novelists, except the very beginning, when they're dispatched, is set at the CDC. So I didn't need to be there. I needed to go, I needed a very close look at the BSL-4 lab, the high security lab in Montana. But happily, because that costs so much money, the government has all sorts of incredibly detailed videos showing it off because they're very proud of it. And so they want everybody to know how it operates and what it looks like and all of that. And so I was just able to drag all that information off of the internet, and I didn't have to schlep all the way up to Montana.
I mean, one of the interesting structural features of the book is the way it opens with Alec and it closes with Alec. So your first entry into the world is this incredibly touching little boy, and your exit from the book is in his mind. But the scenes when he's in that lab, I can't imagine anyone else even imagining them, never mind pulling them off with the skill that you do. And you know, like anybody, I'm just curious how you imagined your way inside Alec's head, into the isolation of those rooms, into what people look like in those giant bubble suits and everything.
Well, all of the technical stuff, as I said, is accessible in all sorts of different ways. And as for the emotional part of it, it turns out that I have a bottomless capacity for self-pity, and that allowed me to access almost all of what it would be like as an abandoned child, essentially. And you know, that sense you have of knowing that somebody wants something from you, and that sort of perverse, I don't want to give it because I don't even know who these people are kind of thing. You know, that's probably a metaphor for my emotional life anyway. So the whole thing was just a matter of, you know, just a matter of channeling the usual stuff that I channel in terms of alienation and sadness and all of that kind of stuff. But I was also very interested in the way you start to realize that people that you don't know much about are doing their best, and the way you start to grant them a certain generosity of spirit. You know, you start to think, well, maybe I should be giving this person a little bit more trust, or maybe I should be giving this person a little bit more credit for what they're doing, you know. And at the same time, you flip that around and think about the people who are trying to do something that feels almost impossible with an enormous amount of pressure on them, and feeling, you know, not up to the task at all. And of course, that's one of the easiest feelings for a writer to channel, right? Is that, can I even do this? I don't think I can do it. Everybody's depending on me to do it, and I can't do it. Of course, the everybody's depending on it is a narcissistic invention, but the rest of it we all believe as we're trying to construct these things.
I think your ability to capture that is part of what makes the book resonate so deeply. The reviews and everyone, you know, we all keep talking about this as a pandemic novel, and it is a pandemic novel, but it also has a much greater resonance than that. You've, I think because of your ability to inhabit Alec and Bronislav and Janine and Denise and their pain and sense of powerlessness and inability to do what they want to do, and those things, you've made it possible for us to extrapolate out from the pandemic situation to any difficult human situation, which means the book, I think, will really last. It's not just speaking to our time right now, it's speaking to any difficult time, any environmental catastrophe, anything that is inevitably going to result from climate change. I really admire that part of it.
I'm glad to hear that. I was really interested in the way, you know, in terms of our complicity with our situation. It's sort of, on the one hand, there's the sort of inadvertent stuff, right? Like, oh, I guess we're, I guess the active layer in the permafrost is really increasing, and what can Andrea and I do about that? And then the much more calculated and capitalistically acquisitive stuff, like, you know, the Arctic is open, well, let's mine the whole northern reaches, right? Let's just do the whole thing. And you're like, wow, you put those two things together and we are really on a collision course with disaster, essentially.
It is as much about climate change as it is about the pandemic, for sure. I know you've been reading about that for a long time.
And climate change is where the book began too, because you know the story of the boy in Siberia who contracted anthrax from anthrax spores that had been dormant in a reindeer carcass that was buried in the permafrost and exposed. That really is what got everything rolling in the first place. Because I thought, oh boy, this is really a when and not if situation that we're headed towards here. And so I just did that thing that, you know, the career counselors are always telling high school kids, right? Find something you're doing anyway and find a way to make it pay, you know? So I was like, well, I'm going to be reading about this one way or the other, so maybe I should try and write about it, you
know? The little bibliographic essay at the end of the book is almost a little book in itself, but does that have in it everything you read, or is that just the tip of the iceberg, as it were?
You know, I think there's a lot of stuff that's articles and stuff like that that I could have chronicled a little bit more comprehensively. So no, that's not everything, but that's a lot of it. And it's, it's I don't know what you would call it, a portrait of a hopeless nerd or something like that. But these works are so crucial to helping me imagine these things that I can't imagine not having some kind of celebration of, you know, the painstaking way they taught me over the course of the construction of the book. You know, I mean, once I decided on the book's design, I was like, okay, so now you need to learn about epidemiology, which you know nothing about. You need to learn about emergency medicine, which you know nothing about. You need to learn about how you get through to a traumatized child, which you know, there were all these areas that I was just like, all right, you know, time to roll up your sleeves. And thankfully, there were a lot of people who helped me as well. You know, so I wasn't just sitting in a room with a book. And in fact, in the case of, for example, some of the excited back and forth that the two epidemiologists are doing towards the end, where they're trying to figure out what's going on. Some of that echoes very, very closely some of the excited conversations I was having with Lois Banta, who's one of the microbiologists at Williams, who was just spitballing with me about how we could possibly do this, you know. And I love being able to dump a problem like that into the lap of someone who knows a lot more than I do. And get them working on it, you know, sort of, so how would this work, you know, and they go, you know, it would be very cool if you could, you know, that kind of thing.
Did you understand what she was saying?
No, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering if you understood what she was relaying to you when you had that conversation. When I read that on the page, it's like, whoa.
Yeah, well, if you imagine like me getting very excited and her getting excited and then me going after being very excited, now could you explain to me what you just told me? And then trying to strike some kind of balance between, you know, obviously these characters are not going to explain to each other the basic concepts, but I also can't have it be completely oblique for the reader, right? So trying to strike that balance was one of the bigger challenges. And I think ultimately I erred on the side of, yeah, if you don't completely understand it, that's okay too. I want the microbiologist reading it to not laugh and throw the book across the room. That's the key thing.
I don't think they'll be laughing. I mean, one of the other things the book does, which again, we don't talk about this much with the novel, because the layer on top is so grabby and so relevant right now. It's easy to forget all the other things that are going on, but it's a great fiction about working science, about really what it is to do, to be doing science in the field when you actually don't know what's going to happen, when you're really formulating hypotheses from nothing. Again, it's great that it's two women doing it and not two men or a man or a woman. So very quietly, we get to watch them building a scientific structure together, and we get to feel what that's like. And that's not something fiction writers do very often.
It's wonderful to hear you say that, because as you know, you've done working science, and the closest I've gotten to working science, I think, is staring at a pipette. So I'm really happy to hear that you think it worked.
No, I thought that part was wonderful.
That's great.
Do you want to turn to questions, or how are we doing for time?
Sure, we can turn to questions. We've already got a few questions here in the chat, and if anyone has any more, please type them in. The first one here is from Karen, Jim. She says, do you have anything to add about the title of the book or its cover?
Do I have anything to add about the title of the book or its cover? The cover is a cover I like very much. I can start there. Very often, I think with most writers I know, they're just hoping to dodge a bullet with the cover. And very often a publisher will say something like, "Oh, do you like it? We love it. If you don't like it, let us know by yesterday." Knopf is sweeter than that, and Knopf asked me about some ideas. Then they came up with, John Gall, the designer, came up with a cover much like this. I suggested tweaks for it, and the tweaks worked out very nicely, I think. The photo that the ominous yellow cloud is occluding actually looks like Ilamanok, the little settlement that I visited. And so it has a kind of a nostalgic appeal for me as well. The title comes from not only the highest level of alert that the World Health Organization can come up with. Phase 6 is about as bad as things get as far as the WHO is concerned. But it's also an unfortunate joke that one of the epidemiologists tells the man that she's involved with about stages of a relationship. And phase 6 is the stage where you're like, it's not you, it's me, essentially. And she tells him that at a very unfortunate time. And she feels as though she's very good at sabotaging relationships without realizing it. So the title is, as one would hope, trying to do at least more than one thing at once.
Thanks.
A good book.
Patricia has a question. She says, did you send a copy to the doctors you talked to at the Greenland hospital?
I did, and I'm quite sure it won't be read. I think they'll do something like, oh, a weird book just came over. Does anybody want this? And probably right now, it's propping up a short leg on a table or something like that. But one was sent to them.
No, they're totally reading that.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. Maybe they're in the back looking at the acknowledgements going, hey, they got my name right. How about that? Right?
Thanks. Joan has a question about Greenland. What was your personal experience of Greenland before you wrote Phase 6? Have you spent much time there? And why did you decide on Greenland and not any other far northern site?
My personal experience with Greenland before I went there was zero. Once I realized that I was going to be writing about one of these mines, it would have to be either Siberia or Greenland. I then knew, well, these are alien enough places that I am going to have to visit them. And then I thought, being a practical person, well, Siberia is going to be a lot harder to visit than Greenland. I also talked to Betsy Colbert, Elizabeth Colbert, who's a good friend of mine, who said, I know a way to get to Greenland pretty easily. So the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, I want to go to Greenland. And once I got myself there, you know, it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know until you get your boots on the ground. And so although I had done, as Andrea had asked me, you know, had I researched and written the sections by then I had, and I knew what I didn't know already, but I also didn't know what I didn't know. And there are some things that just don't show up in research that hit you almost immediately as soon as you arrive there. One of the ones that I've mentioned to other people is, it turns out that most of the settlements are built on solid rock, which means there's all the infrastructure has to be above ground, which means as soon as you're walking around town, you're stepping over endless water pipes and sewer pipes, and everything that has to be strung between houses has to go over the rock. And so it's just this bizarre sort of spaghetti-like tangle everywhere. And that doesn't show up. It didn't show up in any of the reading I came up with. And it's a different way of living, actually, you know. Or you read about how difficult the mosquitoes are, and then you go, no, I'm going inside. This is absolutely intolerable. Unless the wind picks up, you know, everybody's inside. Everybody's inside going, I'm not going out today, you know, in the summer. So there's some things that you do read about, but you can't quite believe it until you experience it. So those are two things about Greenland that and then of course the distances are sort of stupefying. You know, the Ilulissat and Ilamanok on the western central coast, and it's, you know, a 4-hour flight to the next city, you know, that kind of thing. And Ilulissat, which is the big city on the western coast, is about the size of Williamstown, where I live. It's about, you know, 4,500 people, that kind of thing.
Wow.
You know, they have a Kroger's, so they're the big town, you know, that kind of thing.
Again, if you have any questions, please type them in here, but I've got a question for you. What are some other things that you had researched that sort of didn't make it into the book, but it sort of wound up on the cutting room floor? Some interesting things you came across.
Oh, a lot of stuff about the way the permafrost was operating ended up on the cutting room floor. A lot of stuff, I came up with a pathogen that was quite Baroque. And so how that operated, I had a lot of stuff about that the more I thought about it, the more I thought, nobody cares about this. You can throw a lot of this out. One of the things I was very interested in doing, because this was fiction and not nonfiction, was coming up with a pathogen that could genuinely buffalo medical science for a short while. As opposed to something like COVID, where we're like, well, we know what it is, more or less. How are we going to deal with it? I was interested in something like Legionnaire's disease, which when it first hit, everyone was like, we don't even know what we're dealing with here. What on earth is this? And the terror of that, the drama of that seemed very cool to me. And I thought, well, since I'm writing a novel, I can do that, right? And that was another one of those places where having a microbiologist that you could deal with was hugely important, because I essentially dumped that problem in her lap. I said, if you wanted to design something that would be hard to track and hard to figure out, how would you do it? So a lot of the research for that was loaded into the book at first and then had to come back out again. And a lot of that stuff, you find yourself going, at some point the technical has to give way before the visceral and before the emotional. And so you keep sort of going, yeah, this is a good detail, but it's not moving the narrative along, and so it's got to go. So a lot of that stuff was dumped as we went along.
Did you cut anything about the characters? It sounds like everything you took out was informational in some sense. Were there?
I don't cut almost anything about the characters. I think everything that was dumped was scientific and informational and macro. There was a lot of, here's what's going on globally at this point. And I really started to rein that in, to rein that back. I think, in fact, although I don't look back over books with any sort of detail, I think if I did go back through this book very carefully, I probably would think I should have cut more of that stuff. That I could have been even more streamlined in terms of gestures towards what's going on globally, kind of thing.
Boy, I hate to argue with you about your own book, but I can't see it. I think it's so lean right now. I can't imagine what else you could cut. It seems to me there's just enough in there to gesture at what's going on around the whole world, just enough to allow us to imagine, which is one of the other things that makes it so different from a kind of potboiler about similar events. In every point in the book, you just make a little pointing finger towards how many gazillions of people are dying and how quickly things are spreading and what might happen if in fact it comes back and our antibodies really don't work, so that you allow us to do the same thing that you do as a writer, which is to imagine the full horror of what's happening without you stating the whole thing. And I'm guessing that was very deliberate on your part. Is that so?
It is. I'm beginning to think that you should do these events from here on in and not me, because I like your version of this much more than mine, Andrea.
Well, I didn't have to do the work of writing it. So.
Oh, but you're doing a beautiful job of promoting it. Can I just say thank you very much?
I'll take the check when you're ready to write it. So.
I'm ready to write it right now. All of that money that comes from literary fiction, I mean, there's so much, I can just funnel some of it to you, essentially.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a question here from Kevin. He says, Jim, discuss the connections, similarities between Alec and Aaron and the proximity for both characters to catastrophe and death and childhood. Was that obvious to you while you were writing their wry humor in the face of gloom?
Hi, Kevin. How you doing? Kevin goes, discuss. Yeah, I think a lot of my adolescent children sound similar to each other. I try to make them as particular as I can to their places. And God knows, I would hope that a Polish boy in 1942 would sound a little different than a Greenlandic boy today. But they do share a lot of traits. And one of them is that alienated sense of humor, which gets them through a lot of situations. And I think, going back to that comment about our hands go where they've been before, I think when I register that I'm going to be writing about a child again, I have some sense of what those parameters are going to be. The child's probably not going to be the most popular child in class. The child's probably not going to be the most well-adjusted child, that sort of thing. I like going back to those sorts of problems. And the way I talk myself into it is I remind myself that it's not as though I've exhausted the possibilities with those types, and there's absolutely nothing more to be done with them or said about them. But I do recognize that there are similarities that I need to bear in mind as I'm moving forward, essentially. But one of the things that I'm also doing when I'm in Greenland is I'm, in my own creepy North American way, following boys around. From game to game and from situation to situation, and I can't quite figure out what they're saying a lot of the time, but I can figure out the dynamics, and I can figure out a lot of other things about them, and that also helps me tweak it enough so that it's not sounding too much to me like the last boy I was writing about, kind of thing. I hope that's, but if it isn't, Kevin, you can give me another imperative.
Well, I'm afraid we are just about out of time, but Jim, tell us, you had mentioned that the conclusion, the last of the book, was you'd used details from the Lisbon earthquake. Is there any other examples like that where you've taken something from the far past and are using it to talk about the near future? In the novel, yeah.
Oh, are there any other examples like that? No, not from the far past, probably. I've always dreamed of, this is again the kind of psychology you're dealing with here. I've always dreamed of writing about the Lisbon earthquake, and I've never been able to do it. And so when I started thinking about certain emotional positions, I flashed on some of these wonderful narratives, and I found myself saying, well, maybe I can just pillage that. I can just pull it forward, essentially. And I think a lot of the research I've done over the years that hasn't panned out, I guess I'm never going to write about the Lisbon earthquake kind of thing, has been repurposed in that way, where I've sort of gone, well, I can use a version of this somewhere else. If the idea is, how do we as human beings, both as individuals and a collective, deal with these kind of problems and extremists, then you can pull from all over the globe and from all over time and repurpose it. And so I think that's the only case in this novel, but I also might be forgetting something that I just sort of stuck in the memory banks and pulled out when I needed to, essentially.
Well, as I said, we were just about out of time. What's next for you? Do you have another project you're working on?
I've actually done 2 long stories since this thing was delivered. One was about the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, which was veterans who were down in the Keys trying to build the highway from Miami to Key West, essentially. And that's one of those situations where you can get good and worked up about the kind of mistakes we make as a collective. I also, just to make my agent despair even more, started working on a long story about Adolf Eichmann, because who's more marketable than Adolf Eichmann, right? So those are the more recent things. And I think that would be, that might be the definition of whatever the opposite of marketing savvy is. But that's what I've been up to lately.
Jim, Andrea, this has been a delightful evening. Thank you both so much. The book is Phase 6. You can order it from Northshire at the link I'm putting in the chat. Have a great evening.
Thank you
very much.
for coming, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.